Hello BookTube. This is part 14 of my 2022 library tour. Today I'll be continuing with my history shelves. So today will be History 2. Before I continue with the books on this shelf here, a quick explanation of how I organize my history shelves. They're not organized in any way except for by size. The shelves on this shelf here and this one down here aren't standard. The middle shelf here is smaller than the top and bottom shelf, and then the second and third shelves on this bookcase here are smaller than the first and fourth ones. So I basically have to organize by size so that I don't have to tip any books over, because I don't really like that. Because I have my science fiction and fantasy shelves alphabetical when we get to them, and the sibling bookcase of this bookcase here I'm using to house some of my science fiction and fantasy, and every time I see the Legend of the Condor Heroes and totally kind of tipped on its side, I don't like it. I don't like it. So I have my history books organized by size. So anyway, that bit of clearing out of the way, let's get on to the books from History 2. First up is another Alexander the Great biography. The first Alexander the Great biography I ever got. This is Alexander of Macedon, 356 to 323 BC, a historical biography by Peter Green. I've read this at least twice. Once from maybe even twice from my local library, and then once when I eventually finally got around to buying it. This is a phenomenal biography of Alexander the Great. I really, really love it. Excuse me. Next is Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, The Rise and Fall of Byzantium, 955 AD to the First Crusade by Anthony Caldelas. This is a history of the Byzantine Empire, obviously from 955 to the First Crusade. Picked it up from Powell's bookstore in 2020. I think this was one of my first orders from Powell's when I started to buy from them. So obviously in 2020 we were at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and I was nosing about on Oregon Public Broadcasting's website, which I do, and saw there was a little article about Powell's and how the pandemic was harming the business, and how things were getting a bit dicey for Powell's at the time. So I decided to put in an order with them, and I've been ordering with them periodically every few months ever since, and quite happy. They packaged the books wonderfully and stuff, so yeah. And as for Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, it's an interesting book. I didn't exactly love it when I read it in either late 2020 or early 2021. So, anyway. Next is Maoism, A Global History by Julia Lovell. This is a phenomenal history of Maoism. I love this book. Highly, highly recommended. Moving on, I have Iran, A Modern History by Abbas Amanat. This is a history of Iran from the beginnings of the Safavid dynasty up through the Islamic Republic. I initially bailed on the book in 2020 because the introduction is a slog. but then I came back to it in 2021 and loved it. It's really good, particularly on the cultural history. I do wish the Safavids, the Qajars, and to a degree the Pahlavi, well, excuse me, the Pahlavis get enough. Um, but the Safavids and the Qajars, I think, probably could have used a bit more. But anyway, really, really good history of Iran. Next is Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. This is a history of the Eastern Front and of how the conflict between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union sort of affected the countries between Hitler and Stalin. Haven't gotten to this book yet. Really need to. And then I have The Kingdom of the Hittites by Trevor Bryce. This is a part one of a 2 or 3 part history of the Hittites. I have the second part, and I think there's another one about Hittites military that I don't have. This is a fairly academic history of the Hittites. I quite enjoyed it, though. I am fascinated by the Hittites, and I want to pick up more histories about them, although there aren't that many, unfortunately. The ancient history doesn't really get a lot of history, or at least it's not easy to find most of the time in my experience. But yeah, I quite enjoyed Kingdom of the Hittites. Next is Wild Sea, History of the Southern Ocean by Joy McCann. This is a wonderful look at the Southern Ocean, from its discovery to the history of the scientific exploration of the Southern Ocean of Antarctica. This is a wonderful book, just absolutely wonderful. And this is China's Cosmopolitan Empire, the Tang Dynasty by Mark Edward Lewis. This is a history of the Tang Dynasty. It's a really good book. I loved it. Could have been much longer. Anyway, so highly recommend it. I really want to collect as much Chinese history, particularly dynastic Chinese history, as I can. Next is A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronsky. This is a really good brief history of queer history of the United States. It's just really good. I enjoyed it. Next is a massive history of Australia. This is Australia, A New History of the Great Southern Land by Frank Welsh. I read this years ago from my library. My library had a copy of this. I don't know if they still have it though. And it's quite fascinating. It goes through to, I want to say probably the turn of the 21st century. Because I think this came out in the early 2000s, if not earlier than that. So anyway, this is quite good. Although I don't like it as much as I do Frank Welsh's History of South Africa, which we'll get to in a few days. Next is November 1918 by Robert Gerwath. This is about the German Revolution at the end of World War I. So it's basically the fall of the Hohenzollern monarchy, the establishment of what would become the Weimar Republic, the sort of the end of World War I, and the sort of hardening of sort of the right-left conflict that would plague the Weimar Republic up till the coming of the Nazis. This is a really good book. I really enjoyed it. Next is Thieves, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece by Paul Cartledge. This is a very fascinating history of Thieves. I like the earlier parts of the book more than I do the once we get to like past the no. Once we get past the Peloponnesian War, um, which tends to be more the Peloponnesian War, not necessarily as much Thieves' role in the Peloponnesian War, and afterwards tends to get a bit, I don't know, it's been quite satisfied by it, but the earlier parts of um, the book I quite enjoyed, although there are a number of screw-ups in the book, if I remember correctly. Next is A Brief History of the Caribbean from the Arawak and the Carib to the Present by Jan Rogozinski. This is a very dry, dull history of the Caribbean that I didn't particularly care for. I picked this up from a Friends of the Library book sale ages ago and got to it, I think, in either 2019 or 2020 for Nonfiction November and really didn't like it. So, yeah. Next is a history of my alma mater. This is St. Edward's University, a Centennial History by William Dunn. This is a history of St. Edward's from, I want to say, the 1880s or 1890s to the 1990s. I got this, all incoming freshmen got a copy of this, although I don't think we actually had to read it. But anyway, yeah, I've never actually gotten around to reading it. I've dipped into the book a little bit, but not, I've never done a complete reading. I really ought to. Although, of course, a good chunk of St. Edward's history's not there. I mean, I think like the 80s and 90s were not one of St. Edward's most glorious periods. Although, like when I got there, not because I was there, but the president of the university at the time, he did a lot of really good work. And he, I think, retired just maybe a year or two ago, but he was really fantastic. Next is Sea People, the Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson. I read this for the BookTube Prize in 2020. It was one of the ones that my local library had available to check out in its physical copy. And I did actually wanted to check it out in 2019, shortly after it came out, because I'd hoped it would be about either the Phoenicians or the Mediterranean Sea peoples, the mysterious people who appeared at the end of the Bronze Age. But anyway, so I was a bit disappointed, but then was assigned this for the BookTube Prize, read it, and loved it. It is a wonderful history of Polynesia, of figuring out, or kind of, figuring out the origins of the Polynesians, and it's just wonderful. One of the few books for the BookTube Prize that I decided I wanted to buy without having to buy it for the prize itself. This is just wonderful. Next is History and Society by Noah Edward Fell. I picked this up from the Friends at the Library. No, I actually want to say I picked this up from St. Edward's University. I think this is one of the books that I picked up when St. Edward's would periodically roll out some carts in front of the library entrance and have free books, either for discard or just, I guess, donated or something. I think that's where I picked this up from. I remember dipping into it a bit, but don't remember much about it. I probably need to come around and read it at some point. Next is another work of German history. This is Culture in the Third Reich Culture in the Third Reich. I think it said Third Reich. Anyway, by Moritz Vollmer. And this is a history of culture during the Third Reich, and how it looks at how the Nazis sort of took over various cultural organizations, and through that and through various laws, really could determine what was painted, what was written, what was filmed, what people could hear and watch, just how it was done, and how certain high-ranking Nazis styled themselves as cultural poobahs. It was a very fascinating book. Also looked at various regular people and how they interacted with the Nazis and with the culture in the Third Reich. It's a very fascinating book. And finally, the last book on this shelf is A Modern History of Japan, From Tokugawa Times to the Present by Andrew Gordon. This is one of the very few works of Japanese history I have. I would love to have some more. I think I read this years ago from my library and quite liked it and wanted to pick it up, although I haven't come back to it since I added it to my collection. But I do want a lot more Japanese history, which is proving to be a bit difficult to find. So anyway, that was Shelf 2 of History. So I'll be back later on this evening with weekly reads, where I will talk about what I've been reading. So anyway, until then, BookTube, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.